No one ever reported the bodies. Not when the house changed owners. Not when families moved in. Not when children played in the yard. There was no paperwork, no death certificates tied to the address, no public record acknowledging what lay beneath the floors. And yet, people died there. Some disappeared quietly. Others were never named at all. For decades, this house stood as an ordinary structure while keeping a ledger no one could see. A question remains, unanswered to this day. How many people can vanish inside a home before the house itself becomes complicit? The silence did not arrive suddenly. It settled in layers. Long before anyone noticed something was wrong, the house had already learned how to disappear from attention, not physically, but administratively. On paper, it existed as it should: an address, a structure, a tax record. What it lacked were the marks that follow places where people live and die. There were no death certificates tied to the address, no ambulance logs, no police incident reports. For a house occupied for decades, this absence was not normal. But absence rarely alarms those trained to look for presence. County archives told a story of order. Ownership changed hands cleanly. Property taxes were paid on time. Utility records showed steady usage: electricity, water, gas. Nothing spiked, nothing stopped, nothing demanded attention. And so, nothing was given it. Silence is not emptiness. It is a condition. Neighbors would later say they assumed privacy was intentional. The family kept to themselves, but not in a way that felt threatening. They waved occasionally. They collected mail. Their lawn stayed trimmed enough to avoid complaints. There were no arguments that spilled into the street, no police visits with flashing lights, no obvious reason to remember the house at all. When people went missing, their disappearances did not point back to the address. The names were filed elsewhere: other counties, other states, other explanations. A move, a falling out, a quiet exit from someone else's life. Silence thrives on plausible distance. School administrators noticed prolonged absences. Notes arrived late or not at all. The reasons were vague but familiar: illness, family matters, travel. The system accepted them because the system is designed to accept explanations, not investigate them. Medical records showed gaps: appointments canceled without rescheduling, treatments begun but never completed. No follow-up, no questions. When no one demands answers, silence becomes self-sustaining. The house did not generate complaints. It generated neutrality. Social services never flagged the address. There were no prior reports, no history, no pattern visible from a desk or a database. Every agency saw only a fragment, and fragments do not scream. They whisper. Even law enforcement years later would admit there was nothing to chase. No calls, no noise violations, no domestic disturbance reports. The house did not ask for help, and help, unrequested, is rarely given. Silence also shaped memory. Neighbors could not agree on how many people lived there at any given time. Children seemed to appear and disappear between seasons. Adults changed, aged, or were replaced without ceremony. But memory is unreliable when it has no anchor. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was the problem. The most dangerous places are not the ones marked by chaos. They are the ones that blend so perfectly into routine that no one thinks to look closer. Years passed. The house aged, but its story did not. There was no narrative attached to it, only a blank space where one should have been. No rumors strong enough to travel, no warnings passed between generations. Silence does not announce itself as a threat. It presents itself as normal. And by the time anyone realized something had been missing all along, the absence had already buried the truth, quietly, completely, and without resistance. The house did not stand apart from its surroundings. It was not elevated, fenced, or hidden. It rested where it had always been, on a stretch of land that offered no reason to slow down or stare. The road passed without ceremony, no sharp turn, no narrowing, just asphalt fading into familiarity. From a distance, the structure appeared practical, a single-family home built for permanence rather than beauty, neutral siding, modest windows, a roof repaired just often enough to avoid decay. It suggested responsibility, not wealth, stability, not attention. The land beneath it was older than the house, cleared long before zoning maps or property surveys divided it into parcels. The soil was dense, dark, and heavy with organic history. Rainwater lingered longer than expected, pooling briefly before sinking away. Nothing about it was alarming. That was its advantage. The yard followed no aesthetic vision. Grass grew unevenly. Certain patches resisted growth entirely. Others thrived inexplicably. After heavy rain, the ground settled in places where it should not have moved. These were not signs anyone documented. They were things people noticed and forgot. The house itself seemed inward-facing. Windows reflected more than they revealed. Curtains stayed closed during the day, open just enough at night to suggest life inside without offering clarity. Light leaked through cracks and seams, never fully illuminating a room. Sound behaved strangely around the structure. Conversations near the walls seemed to fall flat, as though absorbed. Even laughter failed to carry. The house did not echo. It muted. Inside, rooms had been altered over time, not remodeled, adjusted. Doorways narrowed, storage spaces expanded, walls reinforced where reinforcement was unnecessary. The basement, when it existed at all, was difficult to access. These changes were incremental, each justified by practicality, each invisible on its own. Together, they reshaped the house into something resistant to intrusion. Houses are often described as witnesses, but witnesses usually testify. This one did not. It held its contents closely. Floors were replaced in sections, never all at once. Boards mismatched slightly in age and wear. Nails driven deeper than required. Carpeting installed where hardwood would have been simpler. There was an attention to containment. The backyard told a quieter story. A small plot, bordered loosely by aging fencing. No garden, no play equipment, no attempt to personalize the space beyond basic maintenance. The earth was firm underfoot, except in select areas where it yielded unexpectedly. Animals avoided those spots. This was not superstition. It was behavior. The house did not repel visitors outright. It simply failed to invite them. No porch furniture, no visible welcome. Deliveries were retrieved quickly. No one lingered at the door. Over time, the building faded into the mental background of the neighborhood. It became a reference point, not a destination. A place people passed, not entered. And that was enough. Places do not need to be isolated to become forgotten. They only need to be predictable. The house offered the same view every day, the same closed curtains, the same quiet presence. It trained the eye not to question it. Years later, when investigators walked the property for the first time with purpose, they noted something difficult to articulate. The house did not feel abandoned. It felt concluded, as though its purpose had already been fulfilled. Structures do not choose their roles, they inherit them. This one had inherited silence and shaped itself to protect it. They were never introduced all at once. The family appeared in fragments, as though each member arrived separately in the public memory. No single moment marked their arrival at the house, no moving truck neighbors recalled clearly, no gathering that announced new occupants. Instead, there were adjustments, cars parked where none had been before, lights on in rooms that once stayed dark. At first, there were two adults. Their names existed in records but not in conversation. They were described later only in terms of function, the one who spoke for the household, and the other who stayed behind him. One handled documents, the other handled compliance. Neither encouraged familiarity. They did not host visitors. They did not attend local events. They did not ask for favors. When they were seen, it was briefly, at the mailbox, at the edge of the yard, entering or leaving with purpose, never aimless. They did not linger in shared space. Children came later, or perhaps they were always there and simply went unnoticed. Their presence was subtle. A smaller pair of shoes by the door, visible only once. A silhouette behind a curtain at dusk. A voice quickly silenced when a window was left open too long. Neighbors could never agree on how many there were. That uncertainty mattered. The children were not seen walking freely. When they appeared outside, it was controlled. Short durations, supervised. Their movements were restricted to the property. No bicycles on the street, no casual noise. They learned early to remain still. School enrollment records existed but inconsistently. Names appeared, then vanished. Transfers were requested and processed without resistance. Administrators accepted explanations because the paperwork was complete. Completeness is often mistaken for truth. Patterns emerged slowly. The children aged but not as expected. Growth spurts without corresponding confidence. Speech delayed or discouraged. Eye contact avoided. When addressed by adults outside the household, they looked not at the speaker, but toward the house, as though awaiting permission. Inside, control was constant but invisible. There were no reports of violence, no bruises documented, no cries that traveled far enough to be reported. Discipline was not loud, it was structural. Meals were regimented, sleeping arrangements changed without explanation, rooms were reassigned, privacy was limited and conditional. The house enforced hierarchy as effectively as any person within it. Fear was not expressed, it was absorbed. Extended family members were mentioned occasionally, always elsewhere, always unreachable. Visits were promised and never occurred. Phone numbers changed. Addresses remained vague. Isolation did not require force. It required consistency. The adults rarely raised their voices in public. They did not appear unstable or erratic. If anything, they were controlled to the point of invisibility, the kind of people institutions do not question. Control does not always announce itself as cruelty. Sometimes it presents as order. The family's internal dynamics were never fully documented because no one ever saw the full picture. Each observer encountered a fragment and assumed it represented the whole. A neighbor saw quiet. A teacher saw absence. A clerk saw completed forms. No one saw the pattern forming beneath it all. Over time, members of the family stopped appearing entirely, not abruptly, gradually. One less figure at the window, one less name remembered. No explanation offered because no one asked. The house did not react. It accepted the reductions. By the time the family structure had collapsed inward, there was no one left who could describe what it once had been. The fear had done its work silently, reshaping lives without leaving marks that could be traced back to a single moment. And that was the design. Because families like this do not implode in public. They disappear, one controlled absence at a time.
Secrets do not announce themselves. They creep into corners,
They occupy spaces no one expects. And in this house, the secret was embedded in the very structure, waiting decades before it revealed itself. It began with absence, small at first. A child who stopped appearing at school, a relative who was never seen again, friends who no longer called. Each disappearance was explained, dismissed, or redirected. Moved away, sent to live with distant family. Illness. Vague circumstances that no one verified. And with each story, the pattern remained invisible. Inside, control was methodical. Rooms were monitored, access restricted. The basement, the attic, certain closets, these spaces became off-limits, explained away as storage or renovation. Every alteration was subtle, easily justified, and quietly enforced. Silence grew inside those walls, not by coercion alone, but by design. The house itself conformed to the family's will, becoming a vault. The practices were not chaotic, they were disciplined. Clues existed, faint as shadows. Floorboards replaced with irregular spacing, sections of carpet newer than others. Soil in the backyard uneven in ways that defied natural settling. Neighbors noticed nothing. Their attention was directed elsewhere, toward visible life, toward ordinary events. What lies beneath the surface is rarely questioned when the surface appears mundane. People are rarely absent without explanation, but explanations are enough to satisfy the uncurious. No one pursued verification. Documents said nothing. Records contained no contradictions. And so, the secret grew. Inside the house, there were patterns that outsiders could not see. Items associated with the disappeared vanished. Clothing, toys, personal objects, without any trace. Spaces were sanitized. Evidence, if it existed, was eliminated quietly, methodically. What was occurring was not random, it was deliberate. Each step taken to prevent detection was calculated to preserve control, to enforce invisibility. The family's routines masked acts that would shock anyone who understood their full meaning. Yet the routines themselves seemed mundane. Meals, chores, schooling, errands. Life continued in a slow, measured rhythm. The secret relied on restraint as much as concealment. Noise was kept low, movement was choreographed. And when anyone arrived uninvited, the family presented normalcy, polite greetings, quick explanations, and guidance back towards the door. Suspicion dissipated before it could crystallize. Over decades, the secret became almost imperceptible. A house's memory is long, and it absorbs events, storing them beneath floorboards, behind walls, beneath earth. This house learned to hide the truth not through chaos, but through order, by making every alteration seem necessary, inevitable, mundane. Eventually, the unremarkable appearance itself became the shield. Outsiders rarely question what does not call attention to itself. Routine masks horror. Stability masks violence. And in this house, that lesson was perfected. Even those inside may have believed the secret belonged elsewhere. Fear normalizes itself. Children adapt. Adults rationalize. The structure of control appears to participants as obligation or care. The secrecy perpetuates itself because those who witness too much remain silent, either through indoctrination or terror. Yet the secret was never absolute. Something was always misplaced. A mark in the soil, a misplaced board, an odor too faint to name. Little anomalies accumulated over time, subtle fractures that would eventually signal the truth. And when the silence finally broke, it was not sudden. It was inevitable. The house had collected decades of unacknowledged deaths, undocumented absences, and carefully hidden evidence. Every missing record, every unexplained disappearance, every alteration of the property pointed to one conclusion. The family's secret was not only known to them, it was preserved in every aspect of the house itself. The house did not speak. It only held witness. And what it held would not remain hidden forever. Discovery does not announce itself. It begins quietly, in routine tasks, in curiosity misdirected. In this case, it began with the foundation. A contractor had been called for a minor repair, something ordinary, something administrative. The house appeared solid, even well maintained, but underfoot the soil told another story. Uneven settling, pockets that should have been firm, giving unexpectedly. The kind of detail only noticed by someone who works slowly, who looks closely. No one imagined the truth at first, just a need to correct structural anomalies, dig here, adjust there, reinforce there. Yet the anomalies persisted, and then came the smell. Faint, intermittent, impossible to define at first. Organic, earthy, wrong. Investigators arrived weeks later, not with urgency, but with procedure. The first sweep of the house was methodical, rooms measured, floors inspected, walls tapped, every inch accounted for. And then the basement, or the area designated as a basement, was examined. A crawl space, reinforced unnecessarily, hidden behind a wall of shelving. It was there that the first remains were found. Fragmented, layered, arranged in a way that suggested intention, not haphazard disposal, not accident. The silence that had existed for decades ended in a single, undeniable moment. The house did not react. The earth remained still. The air seemed heavier, yet unchanged. Investigators spoke in whispers, gloves, masks, careful movements. Nothing hurried. Because horror is never immediate. It is cumulative. It grows as each layer is revealed. The first body suggested years of concealment. Soil compaction indicated long-term burial. Nearby, personal items, small pieces of clothing, a toy, remnants of identity that had vanished from official records. Nothing matched any reported disappearances. Names unknown, faces unremembered. Excavation continued. Each section revealed more, remains layered one atop another, interspersed with fragments of daily life, a plate, a shoe, a journal, a small handkerchief. The house had kept its ledger silently, in earth and timber, beneath floors and behind walls. Outside, neighbors had no inkling. No odors had permeated far enough. No noise had carried. Life continued. Normalcy prevailed. The house had mastered invisibility, and in the quiet, it remained unremarkable. Experts examined every detail: soil samples, fabric fragments, structural inconsistencies. Patterns emerged. Deaths were deliberate. Concealment was calculated. Timing was methodical. The family had not panicked. They had followed a system, a protocol of secrecy, refined over decades. Even then, the discovery was incomplete. Not all areas could be accessed immediately. Some parts were reinforced beyond easy reach, some soil too compacted to examine without extensive labor. The full scope of what had been hidden might never be known. Community response was muted, curiosity mixed with disbelief. Some neighbors remembered small details, children who seemed to vanish, lights on at odd hours, but no one had connected the dots. The truth was heavier than memory alone could carry. By the time authorities finished, the silence of decades had been shattered. The house, once a passive witness, had been forced to testify. Each body, each artifact, each layer of earth told the story that paperwork and public oversight had failed to record. And yet, for every item uncovered, there remained questions. Names unknown, dates unrecorded, circumstances uncertain. The house had not lied, it had merely withheld confirmation until someone demanded it. The discovery was complete in fact, but partial in understanding. A rupture in the quiet that revealed not only death, but the meticulous care taken to prevent anyone from noticing it. The house had protected its secret, and in doing so, it had created one of the most chilling revelations in living memory. Silence had ended. The truth had begun. After the discovery, the world outside the house did not immediately know how to respond. Authorities moved slowly. Jurisdictional boundaries blurred responsibility. Local, state, and federal offices consulted files, cross-referenced records, and discovered gaps so large they seemed deliberate. Yet despite meticulous effort, many questions could not be answered. Names remained unclaimed. Dates of death were approximated through soil layers and decay patterns. Even the identities of some remains could never be verified. The house itself became a sealed scene. Barriers went up. Tarped tents covered excavation areas. Investigators wore masks and gloves, each movement calculated, every fragment documented. Photographs taken, samples collected, reports filed. The process was clinical, painstaking, and yet for all the official attention, the house retained its stillness. It offered nothing more than the evidence already unearthed. Neighbors reacted cautiously. Some denied what had occurred, citing disbelief, a protective instinct, or the convenience of ignorance. Others whispered, reluctant to speak openly, aware that speaking too loudly might attract scrutiny. Memories surfaced in fragments, the brief glimpse of a child, the sound of footsteps on floors that were never quite in sync with the house's rhythm, lights that turned on when no one seemed inside. Yet no one claimed responsibility. No one had acted. The community faced a peculiar form of collective shame, not guilt in the sense of wrongdoing, but guilt in inattention. Years had passed, decades, and for all that time, a household had existed within their midst where people vanished and no one noticed. Records were amended, but only partially. Legal documents could acknowledge the discovery, but the past itself remained incomplete. Death certificates were filed long after the events, with estimations instead of certainty. Names were attached to remains where possible, but some would forever remain anonymous. The house changed hands again, sold quietly, discreetly. Renovations followed, windows replaced, floors patched, exterior siding updated. The structure endured, outwardly ordinary, hiding the scars beneath its skin. Life resumed around it as though nothing had occurred, a troubling testament to humanity's capacity for forgetting. Professional observers, historians, forensic specialists, sociologists examined the case with precision, cataloging methods of concealment, control, and deception. Each detail fed into broader studies of unreported deaths, systemic oversights, and the way silence can thrive when institutions fail. And yet, no punishment matched the scope of the crime. Many responsible had died, others were unreachable. The laws at the time had offered no mechanism to prevent decades of unnoticed suffering. Justice, measured against what had been lost, felt impossible. The house left behind more than physical remains. It left a wound in memory. The surviving community carried unease. Even in casual conversation, the subject was avoided. It existed at the edge of awareness, like a shadow that cannot be fully illuminated. For the authorities, the case became a cautionary tale. Reports emphasized procedure and oversight. Warnings were issued about unmonitored households and the importance of record-keeping. Yet these lessons, formalized on paper, could never restore the lives buried without acknowledgment. The aftermath was defined not by closure, but by absence. Public memory fragmented. Records attempted order, but order could not fill the void left by missing voices, missing faces, missing lives. Even decades later, when the house is mentioned, it carries a tone of discomfort, a reminder that evil does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, patiently, methodically, until discovery finally forces recognition. The house, in its quiet persistence, had left behind a legacy, not one of notoriety, but of haunting incompleteness, a record of life interrupted, erased, and meticulously concealed. And while the earth had been disturbed and investigations concluded, the story was far from finished. The human response, denial, erasure, forgetting, remained active, ensuring the house's full truth would never entirely emerge. Silence had been broken, but the echo of it endured. After the discovery, the world outside the house did not immediately know how to respond. Authorities moved slowly. Jurisdictional boundaries blurred responsibility. Local, state, and federal offices consulted files, cross-referenced records, and discovered gaps so large they seemed deliberate. Yet, despite meticulous effort, many questions could not be answered. Names remained unclaimed. Dates of death were approximated through soil layers and decay patterns. Even the identities of some remains could never be verified. The house itself became a sealed scene. Barriers went up. Tarped tents covered excavation areas. Investigators wore masks and gloves, each movement calculated, every fragment documented. Photographs taken, samples collected, reports filed. The process was clinical, painstaking, and yet for all the official attention, the house retained its stillness. It offered nothing more than the evidence already unearthed. Neighbors reacted cautiously. Some denied what had occurred, citing disbelief, a protective instinct, or the convenience of ignorance. Others whispered, reluctant to speak openly, aware that speaking too loudly might attract scrutiny. Memories surfaced in fragments, the brief glimpse of a child, the sound of footsteps on floors that were never quite in sync with the house's rhythm, lights that turned on when no one seemed inside. Yet no one claimed responsibility. No one had acted. The community faced a peculiar form of collective shame, not guilt in the sense of wrongdoing, but guilt in inattention. Years had passed, decades, and for all that time a household had existed within their midst where people vanished and no one noticed. Records were amended, but only partially. Legal documents could acknowledge the discovery, but the past itself remained incomplete. Death certificates were filed long after the events, with estimations instead of certainty. Names were attached to remains where possible, but some would forever remain anonymous. The house changed hands again, sold quietly, discreetly. Renovations followed, windows replaced, floors patched, exterior siding updated. The structure endured, outwardly ordinary, hiding the scars beneath its skin. Life resumed around it as though nothing had occurred, a troubling testament to humanity's capacity for forgetting. Professional observers, historians, forensic specialists, sociologists examined the case with precision, cataloging methods of concealment, control, and deception. Each detail fed into broader studies of unreported deaths, systemic oversights, and the way silence can thrive when institutions fail. And yet no punishment matched the scope of the crime. Many responsible had died, others were unreachable. The laws at the time had offered no mechanism to prevent decades of unnoticed suffering. Justice, measured against what had been lost, felt impossible. The house left behind more than physical remains. It left a wound in memory. The surviving community carried unease. Even in casual conversation, the subject was avoided. It existed at the edge of awareness, like a shadow that cannot be fully illuminated. For the authorities, the case became a cautionary tale. Reports emphasized procedure and oversight. Warnings were issued about unmonitored households and the importance of record-keeping. Yet these lessons formalized on paper could never restore the lives buried without acknowledgment. The aftermath was defined not by closure, but by absence. Public memory fragmented. Records attempted order, but order could not fill the void left by missing voices, missing faces, missing lives. Even decades later, when the house is mentioned, it carries a tone of discomfort, a reminder that evil does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, patiently, methodically, until discovery finally forces recognition. The house, in its quiet persistence, had left behind a legacy, not one of notoriety, but of haunting incompleteness, a record of life interrupted, erased, and meticulously concealed. And while the earth had been disturbed and investigations concluded, the story was far from finished. The human response, denial, erasure, forgetting, remained active, ensuring the house's full truth would never entirely emerge. Silence had been broken, but the echo of it endured. The house still stands, not as a monument, not as a warning, not as a relic preserved in glass. It exists quietly, in the same way it always has, an ordinary structure, holding ordinary appearances, concealing extraordinary horrors. Windows catch the light without revealing the shadows behind them. Doors open and close, quietly, without ceremony. And beneath it, the earth carries memory it cannot speak aloud. We speak of closure as if it is attainable, but some stories resist it. The names we never learned, the lives never recorded, the faces never remembered. Those absences cannot be replaced with paperwork. No report, no investigation, no excavation can fully reconstruct what was lost. The house remains a repository of what cannot be fully known. We like to believe that history is linear, that wrongs can be catalogued, mistakes corrected, and silence broken into understanding. Yet in this house, the past is fragmented. Evidence exists, but it is incomplete. Layers of concealment, decades of careful oversight leave a truth that is always partial, always uneasy. Perhaps the most chilling realization is not what was found, but what may never be found. Even now, beneath floorboards yet untouched, beneath soil yet undisturbed, fragments of human lives may wait, unacknowledged, unnamed. The house has shown us that death can exist quietly, deliberately, without noise and without notice. It has shown that human systems, schools, hospitals, law enforcement can fail not because of malice, but because of inattention. Because sometimes absence itself is sufficient to hide the unspeakable. The families who lived there are gone. Some relocated. Others are deceased. The victims are buried in anonymity, partially reclaimed by investigators, partially reclaimed by the earth. And the community has learned to forget because the mind recoils from the ungraspable, the morally unresolvable. Denial is easier than reckoning. Forgetting is easier than remembrance. And yet we cannot fully let it go. We know the house exists. We know what it held. We know how human lives can be erased, not in chaos, but in quiet order, in silence, in the deliberate cultivation of invisibility. It lingers in thought, the way shadows linger after a room has been emptied, a presence both seen and unseen, a reminder that horror is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is banal. Sometimes it is ordinary. Sometimes it waits patiently for decades until discovery forces recognition, and even then, recognition is partial. We carry the house in memory as we carry all histories we prefer not to face, in fragments, in whispers, in uncomfortable acknowledgment. The earth remembers what records do not. The walls remember what bureaucracy overlooks, and for every fact unearthed, there remain questions that will never be answered. The true weight of the house is not in the dead it concealed, it is in the living who overlooked it, the systems that allowed it, the society that assumed normalcy was sufficient evidence of safety, the comfort of ignoring what did not demand attention. Perhaps this is the final lesson, that evil is not always loud, and tragedy is not always visible. Some crimes do not leave headlines, some families do not leave traces, and some houses, ordinary, unremarkable, yet meticulously silent, carry within them stories that a nation never fully acknowledges. The house still stands, and as long as it does, its memory persists, a dark testament not only to what happened within its walls, but to what humanity allowed to remain unseen. Even as the world moves on, the question lingers. How many more houses like this exist, quietly holding their secrets while the rest of us pass by, unaware? Silence, after all, is patient, and some nightmares never end.